learning is also a lot of forgetting, right? And forgetting is fine. It is not essential to remember everything that you learn. But the key aspect, the key ideas are something that you have to, for one, as a teacher, you need to identify what are the key ideas that I want my students to take away. Okay? There's a term for it. It's called enduring learning, so enduring understanding. Okay? So, and that's what will, stick with you for a lifetime. The other aspects of content are things that you learn. They are like, uh, they're part of the strategy that takes us to the destination. The content knowledge is critical, but not all content knowledge may be equally critical to you later in life. But there are certain big ideas in the content that are applicable for you even later. For instance, the whole point of learning science sometimes could be to look at events, look at the material life, for example, from a scientific point of view, right? And what do you mean by scientific? What is it to kind of evaluate what counts as true? How do we know what counts as true, or what is evidence for that matter? These are all part of scientific. So, how do we get students to engage with scientific thinking, for example, when we're taking a particular class? It is not by teaching scientific thinking explicitly. You could do that, but even when I'm teaching a particular lesson in science, I go into it with a certain depth. Students are likely to understand how did these scientists arrive at this phenomenon. You understand the process through which you arrive at certain facts.
Right. So we covered a lot of ground in this previous discussion here, and just to reiterate so that I also understand properly and for the benefit of our audience. So from working memory to long-term memory, the information goes only if the teacher is using certain strategies, good strategies. We'll come to what does this good means here. So by using certain strategies, teachers can help their students get the information from the working to the long-term memory. And one aspect which you mentioned is spaced repetition, wherein the same content is repeated at a gap of few days, few weeks, or whatever is appropriate, and that helps the students to retain information. And also when during spaced repetitions, the students keep on retrieving the information also, thereby reinforcing learning. So that is one key aspect of the learning design. So thanks for sharing that with us. If if as a practitioner, an educator wants to implement few strategies, you mentioned one like spaced repetition. So can you please give us a list of strategies or the key practices that a teacher can do to help the students, first of all, understand the concept, get them in the long-term memory, retain it, and also retrieve it as and when required? So the strategies or some practical steps, the teachers can use.
Yeah, so I'm sure teachers probably with the practical knowledge can talk about it much better than I can. But broadly, there are some things that I'm sure all teachers use, but just to reinforce. So one, if we discuss some of the things that learning science recommends, for that matter, most important thing is what they refer to as retrieval practice. Now, retrieval practice is like you learn something in the class, and you learn it through different methodologies. You learn it sometimes teachers may use explicit instruction, like directly teaching and asking students questions. Sometimes they may use hands-on activities or project. But even when you do hands-on activity or a project, there's a certain distillation of knowledge. Students are able to articulate. Students should be able to articulate what they learned from doing a certain activity. So it's not enough just to do an activity and move on, but getting the students to talk about what they learned from that, right? So that's one thing. And then you again do retrieval practices, things like asking people things like a quiz, asking students questions, how, what, why kind of questions in a class is retrieval practice. Being able to retrieve what I learned. Okay? And that is much better, even for learning, not just from a teaching learning point of view in the classroom, but even for self-learning. Retrieval practice is a great way to learn. So, for example, I'm reading a text, for instance. I stop at the first page, and then I try to write a short summary of what I learned in the first page. Okay? I'm trying to recollect what I learned from that one page of information, right? So that's retrieval practice, and that helps cement information better than trying to read that same page multiple times. So retrieval practice works better than repeated reading, for example. That's one side. Second one, you just mentioned about spacing. Now, when you talk about spaced repetition, spaced practice, it doesn't mean that you're repeating the same thing over and over again. You repeat the same concept in multiple contexts. So your question, then if you're using spaced practice, the nature of your question will vary. The nature of the problem may vary. The example or the scenario around which you're conceptualizing the concept will vary. So because you need to be able to, so there is a concept called flexible knowledge. Okay? Now, flexible knowledge. Let's say, for example, if you're a teacher, your flexible knowledge is your understanding of pedagogy. Okay? When I say flexible, you learn a certain kind of pedagogy. Now I'm able to interpret it a little creatively based on differing types of learners and different types of learning contexts in which I'm teaching. Right? So that knowledge in a teacher with experience has become flexible. It means I can adapt it to different environments, different kinds of learners, and I can creatively interpret it. Okay? There's something called inflexible knowledge. Inflexible knowledge is a concept by Daniel Willingham, a cognitive psychologist. So inflexible knowledge is essentially not rote knowledge. It's not rote learning. So rote learning is essentially when you learn something and try to memorize it without understanding the meaning of it. Okay? So you know the words, but you don't know what they mean. You're just parroting it in a way.
Right.
Flexible knowledge is where you also understand the meaning, but maybe you're not at that stage where you can creatively interpret it or you can adapt it to a different environment. You need more exposure on that aspect. Okay? So you move from inflexible knowledge to flexible knowledge. So inflexible knowledge is that stage where I'm not able to adapt it to different circumstances or different situations. And then I become an expert, I can become flexible. So it is fine even if I learn something without really knowing how to apply it for some time. I do have an understanding. I have a certain understanding, but I don't know how to do it.
Right. So that was really wonderful. And the teacher should first assess the real knowledge of the students, not just assume that they have that knowledge. So am I right to assume that the starting point of a learning design would then be assessment of the current knowledge of the students, and all plan would be based on the current knowledge that they have going forward, and not just assume that, let's say, grade 4 students would be at this level of of course some assumption has to be there that they may have basic literacy and numeracy knowledge, but then it is important to build in a first step of assessing the real knowledge.
That's correct. But when we say assessing the real knowledge, we should not confuse it with an assessment, like a formal assessment.
Okay. Right.
Confuse it with something like a pre-test or an exam or something like that. And that's where a lot of teacher intuition comes into the picture. So you start a class, you ask a few questions around, you get to know your student better. I mean, every good teacher gets to know his or her students better. Right? And that's a sign of a good teacher. And there are various ways you can do it. You start a class, you tell a story, you see each of the children who are responding, and you listen to the responses. You ensure that every child gets to speak. Maybe it takes a little time. It's not like an immediate thing. Maybe not on the first day that you'll come to know the different learning levels of every child. It takes time and effort for us to know where each child stands. Yeah, and it comes to there's no formula there, but there is tact and there are ways in which you do this so-called assessment, but never a test.
Right. So we'll talk about assessment in a bit, because that's also, one elephant in the room always when we talk about education. But then coming back to the second point you mentioned about different learning capabilities was lived versus textual knowledge. So that is also very interesting. And the example that you gave about somebody being in a natural environment, being able to relate to plants is something which, recently it really occurred. If I can share that with me, I just started to share that with you. I have lived in Delhi all my life and not really exposed to nature as such. Recently started gardening, and my attempt had been to actually learn the names of all the plants, and I was doing that fairly well. But then, one day my household help said that you need to water that plant less, and I was asking her what is the name. She said I don't know, but she gave me a list of 5 signs why the plant needs more water. So even though she may not have that textual knowledge of what the plant's name is, but she has that lived in experience about being around that plant. So yes, that is very important. But then the question is, how do we so lived experiences are very different in a classroom setting. So is there a way, what are your suggestions, that how do a teacher address these differences in the lived in experience of these students? I understand that difference also adds to the richness of the collective knowledge of the classroom. So could there be some lessons where there's this exchange of different lived in experiences happen?
So, as I said, I think every good teacher is adept at getting students to talk about the experience. Okay? In the context, that's relevant to the class that I'm talking about. So, if I'm taking a particular class, as I said, over time, I'll ensure that almost every student gets to speak. And what you will be doing is, by asking certain kind of questions, you're also trying to elicit responses, and you kind of know where they're coming from. So as a teacher, you know that a certain response is coming from lived experience, a certain kind of response is coming purely from textual knowledge, or sometimes it's a combination of two, right? So that is a judgment that a teacher makes, and that's something that no learning designer can plan for.
Right.
Because that happens right there. And that's also one of the reasons why sometimes these so-called self-paced online courses, for instance, they will never have the kind of power that a really good teacher can do in it. Because these are what we call customization and personalization. The real customization, real personalization. What the machine does is a very different kind of a personalization. Right? I mean, there is a certain personalization that machines do, but it's quite different from the way in which I talked about an example of a teacher who elicits responses from students. I'm not saying that all teachers do it, but that's what teachers do.